Well, good evening. I'm Mark Robbins. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture, and I'm not wearing my usual eyewear. My real glasses were left somewhere in New York, and so these were a buck version. So if I put them on, I can't see you, and if I don't, I can't read this. So we'll have to make a choice. I'm very pleased tonight to welcome Evan Douglis, who's the newly appointed Dean of the School of Architecture at RPI in Troy, New York, just down 90, not far at all. Evan and I met years ago, I have to watch your face for this, at the office of Emilio Ambas on Lower Broadway. He had just finished up his undergraduate degree at Cooper Union, a school respected for the intensity and poetry of the work of its students. Beautifully made models and analytic work were shown each spring, and I remember this when I was a student, that if you could get past the gate, they had a really kind of ferocious guard in the lobby of the foundation building. You'd see architecture students from all over the New York metro area mining the exhibition with sketchbooks and taking notes about the ways to make models, the way to use different sorts of materials. And the building itself was renovated by the great Dean, John Haydick. He had worked with students to help recast acanthus leaves for the facade. Then it was rumored that in order to get the plasterwork to be just so, Italian craftsmen were flown in. I don't know if this is apocryphal or true, but Ada Louise Huxtable wrote about the building, saying that there was a clarity and a detail of the consciously sophisticated modernism in its interiors, which speaks of a creative continuity in history and art, which seemed like a good way of talking about that building, but also talking about what we do as architects. And in this building, thinking about the projective nature of architecture, and this building was begun in 1853 when elevators were just beginning to be invented or perfected. And Peter Cooper insisted, and Peter Cooper was trained as a mechanical engineer and inventor, was also a social reformer, but he insisted that a shaft be put in, even though elevators that could really work in this building hadn't been invented yet. And he wanted this vertical conveyance to be enclosed in a round cylinder. One of my favorite parts of the renovation, which was done by John Haydick, was that the Otis Elevator Company actually finally was able to make good on a cylindrical elevator capsule, which now goes up and down in the building. So Evan, like all of those Cooper students who were selected, took that intensity of making and a faith in invention seriously. Evan, I know, saw Haydick as a profound teacher about architecture, art, poetry, and the big questions. He also, I later learned, does a remarkable impersonation of Haydick. You may do something with hands later on, I'm not sure. Evan left Ambas to attend the GSD, and I wondered how the combination of this very New York intensity and Evan's own storefront digs on the cusp of the Lower East Side would translate to the more formal, somewhat more sedate setting of Cambridge. His thesis, as I recall, was about dolls, which must have made some eyes roll. And more specifically, the 17th century French mechanical automata. And in good Cooper Union fashion, these dolls were dissected with drawings and obsessive thin section cuts, a Gray's anatomy of Swiss precision under a sweet, smooth, painted porcelain mask, curvilinear, pink. This wasn't a typical GSD thesis, but it was both unsettling as it was compelling. Returning to New York, Evan began to teach and continued to teach in schools in the United States and in Asia. And it's not surprising that he's remained in the academy. His love of architecture and exploration could be pursued there, no doubt like his mentor, John Haydick, who invented and also made work. His teaching and projects are informed by history, but deeply resonant rather than imitative. Evan was also the curator at Columbia University's Architecture Gallery, and among his notable shows was a show on the work of Jean Prouvé, Nomadic Structures. Here he had designed his own beautiful blue membrane through rapid prototyping, which supported the historic Prouvé prefabrication assemblies. They were in counterpoint with an older system of making things through machines that could be duplicated. Another proposition about manufacturing and form. Evan went on to become the undergraduate program head at Pratt, all the while continuing to work and explore form and materials and representation. The cover of his recent book, or at least the HTML that I got for it, I'm still waiting for the book, Autogenic Structures, displays forms that are lush and baroque, asymmetrical accretions hovering like French taffy curls, frosted peaks of meringue with the hard candy luster of auto bodies channeling the work of Balthasar Neumann. At the book launch in Storefront last year, the press wrote that the work offers an alternative vision for the future of architecture, a timely and invaluable contribution to the debate concerning emergent surfaces and the next generation of building membranes in this era of extreme computational control. Evan has returned to his own training as an inventor and an innovator, and it's a pleasure to welcome Evan tonight to Syracuse University and also the region now as a colleague in a neighboring school. I look forward to having such a gifted neighbor in our northern constellation. Evan.
I would like to start off by saying I too have enormous respect for Mark Robbins, and since he was appointed the dean of your school, it's sent shockwaves throughout the United States and abroad. He's done an amazing job, and I'm thrilled to be a colleague in upstate New York. So I will begin. Now it's a little different now. Okay. I would start off by saying there are questions for all of us that need to be posited, that are specific to this time. We live in an era where the very increment of life is being questioned, is being interrogated, and I'm speaking more specifically about the Genome Project. Man has achieved a certain intellectual and research status that allows us to alter the destiny of living things. And it seems to me, what would be the implications in architecture as a result of that? What would constitute the proper scale of behavior that architects could acquire access to in order to control the destiny of the building components in the next generation? I use the word infrathin. It comes from Duchamp, who spoke about the sound of Velcro, as though something of, how should I say it, a kind of inaccessibility, although incredibly intelligent, resides at a scale beyond the eye. This happens to be ferrofluids, which is a chimerical material that lives between a liquid and a solid. It has magnetic characteristics, and under the right circumstances is able to assume a frozen position. Escher, to me, one needs to kind of rewrite the legacy of Escher. He's been reduced to a kind of illustrator, but it seems that his work is enormously poignant at this moment in history, because if you were to frame a question, a fundamental question in his work, is it possible to create a single unit that has the capacity through replication to create infinite difference? Now, that's not only a kind of conceptual paradox, but it seems to me in a world of mass production and globalization, it would be rather apropos if, in fact, you could reduce architecture to a set of building components not unlike an alphabet that, when rearranged, were capable of creating an enormous array of architectural effects. So the paradox is posing or placing in juxtaposition this notion of sameness versus infinite variation. And of course, Escher and a number of mathematicians have been looking at this question throughout the 20th century, and it's not unlike a puzzle. And if we're going to talk about surfaces that are capable of resequencing in order to make difference, it seems to me we're also dealing with a rather problematic contemporary phenomena where, in the context of globalization, there is a rush towards the signature architect that is moving his or her work around the planet at a rapid speed, irrespective of context. And I think that now I'm raising a kind of ethical issue, but I'm also suggesting that not unlike these kinds of Arabic or Persian surfaces which utilize math as a form of mythical production, there might be a way for our discipline to reassess the kinds of design and manufacturing tools that we have at our disposal in such a way that we're conscious of specific indigenous forces and respectful of the possibility that they can imprint themselves on contemporary architecture. I'm not suggesting that's an easy thing to do, but I certainly think that it's ethically and culturally appropriate. And of course, you know, it's fascinating. We live at a time where the surface, both the surface as a decoration and structure, the surface as technology, the surface as a technological membrane that deals with the ecology of the world, operates according to a variety of forces. And once again, I find myself as someone who finds enormous appreciation within the kinds of multiplicity of effects that operate at the level of the surface. So in this particular case, you have this fantastic blurring between calligraphy that at some moment operates within a legible world, and at the next moment, through its exuberance, becomes illegible. That simultaneity, to me, is, let's say, it represents a space that architecture should always operate. Now I'm using it as an analogical model. I'm suggesting that great architecture has a multiplicity of interests and that it cannot be reduced to only one. This happens to be the word Allah that it disseminates into the field, and at various scales, as I said, optically it may not be accessible, and yet at another moment it might, and according to the audience, obviously. If we're to talk about topological shrouds, another description for the skins of architecture, it's absolutely essential that we consider that the audience, that is the human eye in this case, has a very specific set of logics by which it receives information and it processes it. Op art, to me, is a very unusual art movement that was very conscious of the performative logic of the retina and sought to develop patterns that created the illusion of movement. And of course, once again, there's the benevolent skin. Is it possible to, in the context of acknowledging the fact that there is pathology throughout the world, and specifically within the medical body, that needs to be addressed, to what extent can our intelligence and research on membranes begin to graft themselves into the body to deal with certain inadequacies. And these sets of images are particularly interesting because they operate at three scales. The scale of a structural weave, which is certainly quite familiar to us as architects. The two-dimensional pattern by which that weave will address a surface and an extended area of real estate. And then finally, its capacity to become a three-dimensional shroud in the context of receiving the body. And then we should also address the question of biological mimesis, right? To what extent is there an enormous, an archive of pre-existing information within nature that certainly is endless, and that if we were to listen to it, and in many cases we do, we would find clues, a certain kind of latent magic that could be reapplied to architecture once again at a variety of scales. I think the role of an architect, certainly in the 21st century, is never to come to the table with a bias and assume that in the context of claiming a kind of futurist role, that is, how should I say it, avoiding this entire library of information and research that has taken place before. Another way of saying this is that time, from my perspective, is cyclical. It's parabolic. We move backwards in time to reread history in a new and an innovative way, and then apply it within the context of the time that we live. And I suppose this message is to the students out there that it's absolutely necessary, it's imperative to be able to think of the future and the past as something that coexist, and that there's a synchronicity, and that your role as a creative author is ultimately able to unleash this knowledge and use it in a beautiful, benevolent, and I would say in a kind of provocative, potentially way. You're looking at two images. The image on the left is goosegrass. These are birds that you would find on your clothing walking through a meadow. They would attach themselves, and upon arriving home, they would find a rather savvy lock to the fabric. Upon closer examination, you begin to realize that there is a very sophisticated male-female relationship in terms of a hooking system. And in the context of that analysis, the invention of Velcro was produced, which is the image on the right. So I'm going to show a series of projects. Some of them go as far back as Mark has described, so I'm now showing my age as well. I should preface by saying my career moves between practice and academia. It's an alternative practice in the sense that I'd like to think that one's research can assume many identities and scales. And I've never, both as an educator and as a maker, I've never, once again, applied some kind of privileged status to the scale of things or the context of things. Another way of saying that is that industrial design objects, furniture, installation, exhibition design, interiors, buildings, and cities all contain an enormous amount of research and innovation. and there could be a reciprocity between the work at any one of these scales that could move seamlessly or require a significant translative leap. This project is called Auto-braids, auto-breeding, and as Mark described, it was in response to an exhibition for Jean Pouvet. I had the, I should say, I had the unique opportunity while teaching at Columbia University for 13, 14 years to assume the directorship of the galleries, and rather than assume that the gallery or the museum should be a passive arena within which work is presented. On the contrary, I think that the curator, and I use that word in the most robust way because I think deans and chairs and instructors, faculty of all sorts are curators, city planners, and designer of any type of building, have to recognize that the rule set that they devise is a form of provocation, that the gallery and the museum is an accelerated venue within which an enormous amount of potential debate and discourse can emerge without the colossal or monumental influence of rules, regulations, economic pressures, and so forth. So it was a real blast for me to be able to select either certain work that was traveling or work that was grown out of the gallery and begin to think of certain displayscapes that would have the capacity to participate within a dialogue with the work. So in the most traditional sense, the white box, the pedestal, the plexiglass container is an institutionally devised set of instruments that theoretically are neutral ideologically. I would argue they're not, but nevertheless, in my particular case, there was an interpretive leap made. I'm going to go through this a little quicker. This is a kind of, how should I say it, a computational notepad that's beginning to identify where within any one unit there are certain effects that are emerging. As I mentioned, in the context of the Escher work, there was a computational unit that was devised and aggregated into a field, and there is a set of, let's say, physical units that are about 3.5, 4 feet wide and 12 feet long. And there's 16 pieces that basically snap together to produce this continuous surface. The fold, in this case, was purposely intended in anticipation of a series of observers that would be moving around and through this displayscape. And because of the synchronicity of certain mirrored moves that are made at the local unit, there would be the illusion that that blue surface is actually undergoing a set of wave formations. I should also say that you've got the Pouvet collection that's suspended above this blue surface, and I was looking to set up a very clear juxtaposition. I would argue that if Jean Pouvet was alive today, based on his commitment to profiles, each of his pieces of furniture, and I would argue his building components, can be reduced to a kit of parts, but also more specifically to the performative logic found in the folded profile of his aluminum and steel elements. If he were here today, he would be looking at the computer as a way to identify, once again, a series of mathematical or parametric units that behaved in a certain way that could predict, to a certain extent, the destiny of the built world. There, on a similar level, there is a unit that mass produces or replicates through the field. As you can see in this particular photograph, the the blue surface begins to move into a more relaxed position horizontally and assumes or records or indexes the influence of gravity in the vertical axes. There's a matrix of holes that receive a telescopic aluminum set of accessory hardware that allows all of the pieces in Jean Pouvet's collection to be suspended above. And of course, as the collection were to expand and contract based on the generosity of my co-curator, Robert Rubin, these pieces could be repositioned within the field. So although they were specifically made conceptually for Jean Pouvet, I'd like to believe that there's a certain kind of versatility of the project that could accommodate for any display system. Sorry. These are a series of views, renderings, that are beginning to examine the kind of optical nature. That is to say that based on where the eye is, there's a very different set of effects. And this is something that has fascinated me in architecture for a long time, and that is, it is essential that any great piece of architecture works simultaneously from the bottom up and from the top down. So if the bottom up is looking at the computational equations that underlie the actual materialization of these elements or components, the top down would suggest that we have to be far more conscious of maybe what the phenomenological arrival of the work might be within a public setting. That is to say, what are the experiential opportunities afforded as a result of it coming into the world. I've also been, I think it's imperative at this moment in time that in the context of working with all of these kind of complex form-finding machines and programs, that the sooner we are able to identify the appropriate array of manufacturing options, we're going to be in a much better position to build this work. And that knowledge would fold back into the earlier stages of the design development. This is a 5-axis CNC milling machine. All of those 16 pieces I spoke about were milled out of high-density foam. The vertical fold that you saw in the gallery, where there was a corridor in between, the material changed in that particular context because it was a kind of airplane foam. It had an enormous amount of strength and 50% of the lightness. All these surfaces were treated in critical moments with fiberglass resin and 12 coats of automobile paint. This is another project called Helioscope. We were approached by the Frac Center. The Frac Center has one of, I think, one of the most important collections of architectural models and drawings in the world, contemporary, today. They reside in Orléans, France, and they host a kind of, how should I say, an international event called Archilab every other year. We were invited, and we were provided with funds to design and build an installation which was emblematic of our research. And Helioscopes really was an attempt to look more closely at certain digital practices, but more importantly, this fascination in the 20th century and 21st century with consumption and production. That is, this kind of rush to consume images, to consume experiences, looking for the new. In response to that, we created a helical unit that would be attached to a ceiling system. It could be replicated. This is a reflected ceiling plan. This is a wireframe of the single helical tail, and as you can see, in the lower area there is an orifice which is at eye height, and there would be a LCD screen. In this particular installation, showing images of the interiors of Japanese love hotels. And it seemed to be an appropriate marriage given the fact that you have a rather fascinating phenomenon at the end of the 20th century with these love hotels where one can simply go to the front desk, open up a menu of options, and select a setting that is the recreation of any architectural interior for the last 200 years. It's certainly perverse and threatening to our discipline that history would be treated so willfully as a commodity. But nevertheless, it is an industry, and it does quite well throughout Japan. I was using that as a kind of, I'm proposing that as a contemporary phenomenon is, once again, is indicative of a world within which we live that is constantly looking for the new. And in architecture, what would be the implications of that? I mean, I use the word threatening. I think it's both problematic because I think architecture needs to construct forms of resistance, but at the same time, it has to be conscious of the fact that it resides within this larger capitalist and economic theater. This is a view of one of the tails. It's important to point out, similar to the Auto-braids, auto-breeding project, that there are very specific topological effects that we were looking to achieve in order to create the illusion that this is continuously in flux. And there is a center spiral that controls the entire tail, and there's a series of ribs that are moving around that in order to produce that illusion. Once again, the question is how to construct these things. It was CNC milled out of foam, but in this particular case, we needed to translate it into a lightweight structural shell. So you're looking at a foil paper that is closing the surface in order to receive 15 removable pieces that will be clad around the master in order to produce the fiberglass piece at the end. This is the entire piece. Of course, in the earlier design, there were a series of components that moved on the perimeter in order to kind of retrofit this into a single room. So I was always anticipating the possibility that the helioscope could exist as a single entity, but it could also be replicated endlessly within a field, and more specifically, a public venue where there would be a curator that could control all the video footage. For the FRAC Center and Archie Lab, we were showing one video, but I'd like to think that all of our projects have a life after the specific scenario that they were designed for. This is a photograph of the final piece. As you can see, there's a kind of fantastic exuberance in terms of that flux I was talking about. These are a series of shots that move around. It's in the permanent collection at the FRAC, and I believe that within the next year there'll be a major opening, and this will be presented to the general public. It has been shown in Scandinavia. This is a shot of the LCD screen, and there's a seam around that window, which means you can remove it. This can work as a wireless system, or it could be networked to a computer. The next project is called Reptile. This was a Japanese restaurant on the Upper West Side in New York City. It was a very small space. The client had seen our work, was fascinated by the research with the surfaces, and was interested in us creating a custom tile system that would be specific for this project. So what you're looking at is, I mean, there are a number of ways to engage early on with a set of questions that allow us to materialize those questions. There's a script that's underlying this video. There are a series of pyramids that are undulating at a very specific sequence, and then the color smooth surface is functioning as a kind of floodplain. the juxtaposition between them, like a game of jazz, is looking for a series of unexpected effects. I have to say that and this is certainly not new to me, there are a number of artists in the 20th century that use or deploy a methodological system that allows chance to participate within the work. I do not start a project and I may have an idea of where I'm going, but I certainly don't have an image. And I'm always working through a series of iterative experiments where I'm testing that research again and again and again, and I'm able to step back objectively and try to qualify the work in terms of assigning a value system to it. So in the context of that research within the animation work, you're seeing an oblique photograph of what is comprised of 10 master tiles that are approximately 6 inches high, 2.5 feet long, and 4 to 5 inches deep. So they certainly pack quite easily because they're part of an orthogonal or Cartesian grid, but there are very specific, I would say, siblings that allow the undulation of the pyramids and the smooth surface to find continuity. The larger aim of this tile system was that within the small space, which you'll see in a second, and the kind of privileged linearity of that space, I was anticipating that there would be hundreds of I would say, clientele that would be moving into the restaurant and walking parallel to the surface, and to what extent might the surface be able to create the illusion that it's actually moving forward and moving back. I should also say that in the context of a kind of mythological inscription, the client was fascinated by reptiles. And there were some long discussions about how his interest in those creatures might be indexed within the work. And I made it very clear I had no interest in recreating the iconography, and I've never had. I've always thought that there can always be a kind of underlying performative logic that speaks to a series of associations without having to carry the image of them. This is a view of the exterior elevation of the restaurant. It's made up of a series of striated horizontal aluminum powder-coated bars that are 1/4 inch thick, 3 inches deep, with a 3/4 inch space. It's functioning simultaneously to create a kind of quiet canvas in juxtaposition to the animation inside. But it's also, based on the circumstances, the exhaust in the kitchen had to be exited. The intake and outtake air had to come through the front facade, so it's camouflaging the entire mechanical system. These are views of the inside, sushi bar at the end, some more views of the tile system, a view from the back looking forward. And here's a couple of shots of the fabrication. We CNC milled out of wren shape the 10 masters. We created mother molds that had flexible urethane inserts that could be pulled apart after you have reached the kind of, in quotes, ceiling or limit of the mold material. And on the left, this is a back and front view of the tile system made out of a urethane plastic, very lightweight, held onto the wall system through a cleat. And that is a machine in the back that the mold goes into in order to exert pressure and remove all the air bubbles out of the pyramid system. This is another project called Floorflex. We were selected by EKWC. It's an international ceramic work center that is about 45 minutes out of Amsterdam in Holland. And they are notorious for having one of the most kind of remarkable resident programs for ceramicists and artists in the world for many, many years. And I believe in the last 6 or 7 years, they've opened it up to a variety of disciplines, and more specifically to architects. It occurred to them, and it was pretty smart, that ceramics should no longer, and never has been within our discipline, but in terms of their mission, reduce to crafted one-off objects, but rather could the masonry and brick industry work in some collaborative way with this organization to promote research on the new brick in the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century. So the question was, that was posited to all the participants, what is the new brick at this moment in history? I'm kind of shooting forward here. These were a series of units that are about 24 inches in the X, Y, and Z axes. They function, I'll show you some close-ups in a moment. It's a slip cast piece that stacks. There's an A and B piece. I would say the larger intention of the unit was to simultaneously reaffirm the fact that there's a vertical membrane, a datum, a separation. We were testing this as an interior screen system, but it certainly could move over and out into the world as some kind of exterior facing. But at the same time that it has the attribute of being transparent, we were interested in its ability to be opaque. That is to say, based on one's relational position to that membrane, you would either be able to see through it or not. The main unit, which are the two horizontal pieces, is comprised of rings, and now I'm talking about the generative kind of approach to it. There are a series of rings with flanges that are spinning around those rings and beginning to almost aspire to a certain kind of botanical formation. In other words, the script that was produced, and you'll see a second variation, is suggesting that you could achieve difference simply by a single profile moving 360 degrees around a point in space. And the two pieces, the two elements in the vertical orientation are really the kind of infill. They deal with the kind of stacking, and the lower piece is what meets the ground. This is the four pieces combined together. I should say that there's a much longer discussion in the context of signifiers. It's fascinating at this moment in time to be able to assume control of computation and the level of specificity that you can acquire. It requires an enormous amount of time, and if anyone tells you otherwise, it certainly doesn't speed up one's architectural production. On the contrary, I would argue that it can slow it down significantly, but once you're able to achieve the effects that you're looking for with very subtle modifications, you now can assume control over a parametric field of variation. That's the beauty. So all that history you put into it functions as a kind of intellectual fuel in the later stages. We were approached, after that project, we were approached by the Museum of Modern Art. There was a private invitation to examine or come up with a proposal for a prefab wall system, and this was our entry piece. This is the same unit, although proposed at a much smaller scale of the A and B pieces. This measures, I believe, about 10 feet high and 4.5 to 5 feet wide. And what we're doing here, as you can see in this view, there is a second flange system that is rotating around that radial frame at a different sequence. So we're able to take what would have been, in the first iteration, a series of repeated base units. In this particular case, we now have 15, 20 elements. Would this be much more complex to manufacture? Absolutely. Would we be slip casting these? No, we wouldn't. We'd be proposing that this would be entirely 3D printed. And that raises a whole nother question, because in this project in particular, I would say there's a kind of bifurcation in the road. I still have an enormous amount of appreciation and fascination with ceramics and slip casting in particular, and in the context of moving forward, I think this piece has, although it's proven it could be made in slip cast, it would move over into a 3D printed manufacturing process, and I would probably return back to slip casting with an entirely different morphology in the context of a brick. In the spirit of those comments about computation, it's kind of interesting now that you can begin to, well, you can imagine new membranes, ones that may not be able to be built yet today, and yet that's fine. It seems to me the great thing about our discipline is there's always a group that's looking 20, 30, 40 years ahead, and there are always those that will figure out how to make something that is seemingly impossible real. I offer this this swatch as a kind of an ideogram. Color coding is suggesting that there could be, in an ideal situation, this kind of beautiful mix or marriage between elements that assume a privileged status of structure, a secondary status of structure, and a tertiary. There could be elements that are functioning as, I would say, a kind of ecological network where energy is being absorbed outside in the world and sent into along very specific circuits and currents. And the coloration is proposing that there would be a kind of new organizational tweed in the future in terms of next generation building components. And these are a series of iterative studies looking at ways in which these kinds of cosine woven lattices could begin to produce different effects with respect to porosity and opacity, but also in terms of structure, right? The areas could, although they may be very thin because there's a higher density and calcification, they could assume a kind of structural priority, and other surfaces would maybe reduced to decorative surfaces, which I don't see, unlike Los, problematic whatsoever. And once again, it's kind of interesting in the context of making anything, when do you exceed a limit? And what constitutes a flaw that may, how should I say it, code or make pronounced one problem, but also maybe certain opportunities could emerge. And I'm speaking more specifically about the exaggeration in this particular case of the scaling and size of these pieces, where they begin to trespass or transgress certain striated zones and move into other areas. I would argue that this is early research which we require much more time, and I would say very specific programmatic challenges in order to address whether it's working or not. This was running concurrent with a project called the L Tower. We were approached by a developer on the West Side Highway in New York City. I think it's the U-Haul building. It's the largest building in terms of footprint, I believe, in New York City. It's longer than the Empire State Building. The developer was in the process of putting together a group of developers. They wanted to buy the building, keep the tenants in there. One of them was Bloomberg. Occupy the roof with a series of commercial and retail pavilions, and put a hotel on the north side. You're looking at a very, very kind of quickened early version, a kind of a view from a plane looking down. We're also inside looking up. The the proposal that we came up with was that the retail buildings would be designed and managed by the owners and their architects, and we would create a continuous skin. The client wanted it to be an open-air membrane. I don't believe there's one in New York City, and that is to say that once you've gone through one of the stores, you would go out. It would be open to the elements in terms of sun and wind and light, and then you would move across this kind of urban skyscape back into a building. I was talking about the hotel being at the north side. This is, I think we're looking at a 12 to 15 story building, the base below, and we're coming up another 30 floors here. The role of this new architectural skin would be simultaneously one that would have to deal with the environment in terms of shading, in terms of a microclimate. We were collaborating with Arup, and at the same time it had to assume a very important role, which is its branding. There would be a series of penetrations at critical moments that disrupt the woven membrane. We were considering a whole series of material possibilities. At the end, we decided that it would be made out of metal. These would be laser-cut components that would be assembled together. And although some of the early renderings speak about a kind of three-dimensional thickness, in the context of the budget and the economics of this potential project, we needed to find in a very, very efficient module, as I've spoken about throughout the lecture, that could be replicated quite easily and for a reasonable amount of money, and one could then retrofit a series of flanges, as I was showing in the renderings, on top of this in order to produce the variation we were looking for. This is a diagrid, and this is a 3D print model. This is a second version where the tower is probably only half as high as it originally was, and it doesn't rotate in terms of its vortices. But as you'll see, there is a flux in it, and the membrane begins to unzip itself at critical moments to open the streets, in a sense, to the sky. These are a series of shots. And these were some presentation drawings that were just looking at a kind of schematic diagram of a columnar system that would elevate the membrane 30, 40 feet above the retail stores. And here's another shot. There would be greenscapes on top of the buildings. We did a cost estimate. We figured it would probably be, including having to prepare the existing roof, both structurally and mechanically, to take on this ambition. It would probably be $500 million to build it, sorry. And although the client was very excited by this project, the recession hit us, and this was put on hold. So I have no idea whether this will become viable in the near future, but it certainly would have been an amazing project to test a lot of our research. This project is the title of the lecture. It's called Moon Jelly, and this is a restaurant that just opened about 2 weeks ago in Dumbo, underneath the Manhattan Bridge in the Brooklyn side. And it's a restaurant that's about 3,000 square feet. It serves French country food. And as you will see in some successive images, the main area of attraction is the ceiling. You're looking up at the reflected ceiling. There is a hex tile that repeats through this field. One of them is the more robust one that is the recipient for custom chandeliers that we created, an acoustic sound system and the sprinkler system. So all of the, in quotes, the kind of network of controls actually nest themselves within the field, and there's a filigree hex tile which you'll see at the perimeter. This is a wireframe. You know, in the spirit of some of the other projects, and I think a restaurant has been a great program to be able to kind of pursue these interests. At what moment does architecture take on a theatrical role? What kind of opportunities are afforded within our authorship to create many different experiential arenas? And certainly, restaurants are always dealing with themes and a certain form of escapism. This is that main tile I was talking to you about, referring to before. This was created on the computer. Once again, you have a manufactured system that has to repeat a tile, but at the same moment, is it possible to develop the surface so that the eye is unable to find the autonomy of that single entity, and it begins to move through the field, you know, according to a series of affiliative moves. In other words, I would have to show a series of analytical projections to show you how these swirls that are going in a concave and a convex direction are beginning to establish reciprocities that I would say almost kind of dematerialize or challenge center. That flattened version is that second system, and this particular photograph is a shot of the casts that have come out unpainted and without the perimeter tiles in terms of a capping system. There were 120 of these to produce the ceiling. There's a series of, as I mentioned, there's a series of kind of end condition elements. There's 13 customized pieces that end the field as it transitions into the filigree and the flatness of that second tile. These are a series of views within the manufacturing shop. This is a reflected ceiling plan which shows you that the main tile finds an irregular pattern prior to coming to a terminus within the rectilinear edge of the ceiling system. Those two cutouts are cutouts for structural columns that are passing through. This is a section through the restaurant. This is a close-up, not unlike the first project I showed today, where one has to map the coordinates of very specific elements in the context of the assembly in the field. And the beauty was that we were able to, although it took an enormous amount of time to design this, to manufacture it, to finish it, when it came to actually putting it up, it was very straightforward, and we were able to do it in less than a week. This is a shot of the restaurant in terms of some of the other materials. The vertical surfaces are clad with a stone from China, which looks like a petrified wood. That's an existing concrete floor that's been polished. This is black walnut furniture. Our original scheme had a far more, I would say, exuberant free plan of furniture below the ceiling, so that there was a conversation from the top down and from the bottom up, but the client decided, as we all know, in certain cases, to maximize the economics of the restaurant and decided to go to banquet seating. This is a close-up of the chandelier, and I'm going to show a video in the next shot which describes how this was produced, but very quickly you're looking at a wire cage. It's almost like a structural corset within which the glass is blown, and there are a series of pieces of hardware that can be adjusted on a continuous basis in order to find the proper dimensional aperture for the glass to properly receive this. Or another way of putting this is that that corset is taming the glass to behave in a certain way, and you'll see this right now.
I think what's amazing about this moment in history, it's an era of immateriality. What we may have thought in the past become at risk. It's fascinating to me to think of the juxtaposition between kind of hyperspeed and stillness. To pick up glass and reconceptualize it in a way no one has ever thought about it before. Work with glass as a breathe a different kind of soul space, a different kind of thought into it. The chandeliers are this, I think, fantastic that takes place in our cage that we've designed. Lower. Her craft into the central space of the cage. Plate the glass from a kind of molten blob in order to bring meaning into the world out of this formless matter. The cage has to have a very specific didactic agenda built into its geometry. Identified a very specific choreography and line work. The arrival of the glass allows the glass to effectively inflate, bifurcate at critical moments in time and space, so that something of a kind of biological order can emerge at the moment of reaching a kind of tolerance. And in this case, it's actually the accident, right, and the unexpected, which is being privileged. Fascinates me to consider my role as an architect, an educator, a maker, and inventor in the 21st century as someone that can acquire a multiplicity of tools and material practices that are both smart and intelligent and fresh without very little time in history, as well as timeless rituals and methods. I hope to think that in this project, something of unique ambience in terms of effects brought into the world.
Okay, and these are some more shots. I mean, similar to the Helioscope project. It seems to me within a contemporary time, the ceiling is a kind of undervalued datum by which an enormous amount of influence and provocation can take place. The footprint of the restaurant is certainly there's an enormous amount of economic pressure to maximize the efficiency value of it. And in the context of this project, it's the ceiling where all the theatrics are to take place. So as I mentioned before, here's a juxtaposition in terms of surface development. This is another shot of the reflective ceiling plan. And I would conclude by saying that I mentioned earlier about the fact that although there are very specific design proposals that marry projects, there has been an assembly of a kit of parts. There's probably about 6, 7, 8 now building components that we have produced that we're in the process of mass producing as consumer items that could be distributed globally, and the recipient would be not only a client, but in this particular case, a designer that would have an entirely different perspective on how they would become resequenced, refinished, and what kinds of effects they may have that are specific to their project. So it's functioning on 2 levels. One is we'd like to think that the work is now moving out into a commercial arena where we would be able to take on the demand of buildings at any scale, and at the same time there's these building components that function as a kind of anagram. Thank you very much. Any questions? I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, I have a question just to kick things off. Thanks for a really provocative lecture. It's great work. You hinted early in your lecture at the potential for computation and optics to somehow collaborate in a potentially subversive or non-submissive way. And I'm interested because, as you mentioned, the retinal has long been dismissed or even vilified for operating in either merely commercial ways or, at worst, spectacularly oppressive ways. So I'm interested in how we might position or think of a potentially kind of retinal architecture of resistance.
Wow, it's a great question.
You have to answer it in 8 words or less.
6 words, please.
Can I do it in Latin?
Yeah.
Well, it just seems to me that architecture functions on a very complex level psychologically, and it will move back and forth. When I mentioned the signifiers, there are certain associative components that make up the assembly of anything that exists in the world that can be traced back or forward in time, so that there is a syntactical origin to things. Sometimes we're more conscious of that, as the postmodernists were, and sometimes we would like to purposely repress it. I would also say that there, not unlike Hitchcock, there are ways to manage flurry and flux and angst and certain even problematic psychological tendencies in such a way that they have a productive use. So I'm very cautious of assigning a value system to things. And I'm also very careful that, excuse the pun, that I would not overly script the relational correspondence between the audience and the architecture so that it becomes predictable. but I am always interrogating the things that I'm making in the context of putting them into space, into real time, and acknowledging the fact that real bodies ultimately participate, consume, name, and reframe the work. And it would be seriously problematic if one was to leave that outside of one's interrogation along the way. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. It was a good one.